The Aetherizer is an absolutely insane effect within Absynth that essentially takes an input signal and then turns it into lots of tiny grains which you then have control over. Essentially what this does is like shattering the signal into lots of parts which you can then transpose and pitch around and change the rate of. So what I've done is I've loaded in the vocal sample, and I'm going to switch in the effect. And when I switch it in, you'll notice to start we get almost kind of like a cross between a chorus and a room reverb setting on here. Now let's go and have a look at this. Now essentially the Aetherizer breaks down into 3 sections. At the top here we have a post delay. This is the delay that sits after, sits at the end of everything, and works in essence like a normal delay. If I turn this up again, let me just sync this in and bring this up. Now I've also got feedback, and then essentially a low pass filter on the repeats. So if I bring this all the way down, it essentially acts as damping on the repeats from the feedback. So let me just switch this off for a second. Now the other 2 sections are the grain and the tone. Now the grain gives you control over all of the individual grain parameters. So for example, I can delay the onset of the grains by changing the pre-delay. So we're at 127, so that's going to be roughly 230 for an 8th note. So I can delay the onset like that. Now the rate controls the input grain, so essentially how many grains are available at input. If I turn this up, let me bring the dry signal off. What you can hear is at higher frequencies more grains are available. So let me bring the feedback for these up. This is the feedback loop in here. As I drag the feedback up, the cloud smears at 100%. We get this real smearing across the stereo spectrum. Grain duration gives me control over the individual grains, so the length of the grains. So as I drop this down, they're going to get thinner and thinner. Let me bring the frequency down, the rate. And you can hear more of a cloud. Now the display at the bottom here gives you a kind of visual representation of what's going on. You can see the grains here are spreading out at smaller frequencies. There is a degree of randomization for each of these. So for example, I can randomize the something like the rate and, well, feedback and the grain duration. Let me bring the grain duration up a bit. Okay, let's take these off for now. On the right hand side here we have tone. Now tone gives me essentially control over the tone of each of the grains. So for example, overall I can bring up the transposition and you can see the grains here on the display are rising up from the original pitch. So if I bring these 2 in together, you know, we can get some absolutely crazy effects in the background. But where this really excels is when I switch in the filter. Now when I switch in the filter, we have 2 different filter settings. We have band pass and cone. So let me bring the transposition down to 0 again. Essentially what I can then do is I can filter the grains using the frequency control here. Like this. And I also have access to the resonance here as Q. Now if I push this up, as we get into higher settings, it kind of almost self-oscillates. We get into this situation where they start to become more and more tonal. Like so, as I drag them up and down. Now at these high Q settings, this filter Quantize really comes into its own. If I click here, what I can essentially do is I can now quantize the grains to particular types of chords. So, for example, a minor seventh. We can hear that now transposed to a minor seventh chord, and I can change this to a major seventh. Back to a minor seventh. Now, I have the ability to transpose these as before. Now, if I come to the transposition here and I randomize, I can essentially smear all of the grains around the cutoff here, and each of them is then still quantized to that particular chord. And as I brighten this, you can see this represented in the display here. Just bring that down a bit. And I can increase the rate still. So there's a lot to be said for setting something like this up and the interplay between the different parameters. So push the feedback up. It almost becomes continual. As I slow the rate down, it almost becomes arpeggiated. Now there is another filter setting called comb, which brings in a comb filter. Now, we still get the quantization, but it's a lot darker. And essentially for this to work, you kind of need to make sure that the frequency here is above the rate, because otherwise it's too fast for the comb to do what it needs to do. So for something a little bit more atonal, a little bit scary, I suppose, the comb is the one to go for. Now the Aetherizer takes a bit of practice and it's very input signal dependent. If you use it on sustained sounds like pads or strings, the effect's fairly subtle. Put it on vocals or percussion or any short sound and the effect is a lot more marked. This is definitely an effect to experiment with.